Why does the collapse of a single country's currency trigger panic across entire continents? In 1997, we witnessed exactly that, and today, the same signals are quietly returning. The history of global finance rarely repeats itself word for word. But the rhythm, the psychology, the mistakes, those always come back. And the Asian financial crisis of 1997 is one of the clearest examples of how something small, something that looks too insignificant to matter, can suddenly ignite a regional collapse. A collapse that spreads faster than anyone can react. A collapse that reshapes economies for decades. This story is not just about what happened back then. It's about what that crisis warns us about today. Because many of the same conditions that existed in 1997 have begun to reappear in our world again. Before we dive deeper, if you enjoy financial history presented clearly and calmly, feel free to like this video and subscribe. It helps this kind of long-form, in-depth analysis reach more people, and it helps you stay ahead of the signals that most investors ignore. Now, let's go back to the early 1990s. Southeast Asia was booming. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, South Korea. They were called the Asian Tigers, and their economies seemed unstoppable. 7% growth, 8%, even double-digit growth in some years. Factories expanded. Foreign capital poured in. Cities grew at unbelievable speed. And the world began calling this the Asian miracle. But every miracle has a shadow. And beneath the surface, something was very wrong. Growth was not built on strong foundations. It was built on short-term foreign loans, on inflated real estate markets, on rapidly rising corporate debt, and on the belief that money would keep flowing in forever. It was growth fueled by hope, not by structural strength. And hope is not a financial strategy. So here is the question that begins our investigation. How did a crisis that started in Thailand bring down almost the entire Asian region within months? To answer that, we must look at July 1997. For years, Thailand kept its currency, the baht, pegged to the US dollar. It worked as long as confidence remained high. But when investors began doubting the health of Thailand's economy, capital rushed out. The Thai government tried desperately to defend the currency. They burned through billions of dollars in foreign reserves. And then, the reserves ran out. They had no choice left. They abandoned the dollar peg. The baht collapsed instantly. And when the baht collapsed, the illusion of stability collapsed with it. Investors around the world suddenly asked, if Thailand is that fragile, how strong can the rest of Asia possibly be? That one question triggered a massive exit of capital. Fear spreads faster than facts. And in financial markets, fear becomes reality very quickly. Money didn't just leave Thailand. It fled the entire region. Malaysia's ringgit plunged. Indonesia's rupiah fell by more than 80%. Banks failed. Corporations collapsed. Projects froze. Millions lost their jobs. Economies that had been praised as unstoppable were suddenly fighting for survival. And then came the moment that shocked the world. South Korea, one of the most advanced industrial powers in Asia, began to fall. Huge conglomerates, Hyundai, Daewoo, LG, had expanded aggressively using debt. When the crisis hit, those debts became impossible to pay. Factories slowed. Suppliers collapsed. Banks stopped lending. South Korea, a country considered too strong to fail, was forced to request one of the largest IMF rescue packages in history. So now another question appears. Why does a currency collapse in one country push investors to abandon an entire region? Because all the Asian tigers shared the same weaknesses: short-term foreign borrowing, dollar-denominated debt, rapid credit expansion, overvalued assets, and far too much confidence. Once Thailand fell, investors didn't bother analyzing country by country. They simply assumed the others would fall too. This is how contagion begins. And in 1997, contagion spread with brutal speed. Investors ran not because the data ordered them to flee, but because someone else already had. This behavior has a name: herd behavior. And in every major financial crisis, it is herd behavior that accelerates the collapse. Banks began freezing credit. Corporations couldn't roll over their dollar debts. Local currencies continued falling, and each fall made dollar debts even more expensive. A vicious cycle had begun. The International Monetary Fund eventually stepped in with giant rescue packages. Billions of dollars flowed to Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. But the IMF conditions were painful: raise interest rates, cut government spending, close weak banks, force corporate restructuring. These steps were designed to restore stability. But in the short term, they deepened the recession. Unemployment soared. Public anger exploded. And the crisis grew into a political and social disaster in several countries. Which brings us to another uncomfortable question. Does the IMF always save economies, or can it sometimes make crises worse? The answer, as always, is complicated. And in 1997, the truth depended on which country you were standing in. Some nations recovered quickly, others suffered for years. But the crisis revealed a deeper truth. The Asian miracle was not as strong as it appeared. It was vulnerable, deeply vulnerable, because it was built on borrowed money, on fragile currency structures, and on the belief that growth would continue forever. Growth built on debt is not real growth. It is borrowed time, and borrowed time always runs out. When the crisis spread across Asia, each country reacted differently, and those reactions shaped their futures. Malaysia chose a path that shocked global institutions. Instead of accepting IMF conditions, the government imposed capital controls to slow the outflow of money. Economists criticized Malaysia heavily at the time. But years later, many analysts admitted something surprising. Malaysia's decision softened the blow. Malaysia didn't end the crisis instantly, but it bought time. And in a crisis, time is everything. Indonesia, however, faced a different nightmare entirely. Economic collapse triggered social collapse. Prices skyrocketed. Riots erupted. Political tensions exploded. The Suharto regime fell after decades in power. Indonesia showed the world that an economic crisis can break banks, but a social crisis can break nations. South Korea's story took another direction. As the crisis deepened, citizens lined up by the millions to donate their gold to help repay the IMF loans. People surrendered their wedding rings, necklaces, bracelets, a powerful act of unity during a moment of disaster. This symbolic sacrifice didn't solve the crisis alone, but it demonstrated a rare collective spirit. After the crisis, South Korea implemented deep reforms. Debt rules were rewritten. Oversight strengthened. Transparency improved. South Korea used the crisis as a turning point, not a tombstone. So why did some countries collapse, while others used the crisis to rebuild stronger than before? The answer lies in leadership, transparency, and the willingness to accept painful reforms. Crises do not destroy nations. Denial does. But why did the crisis spread so fast in the first place? Why did investors abandon not just Thailand, but Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and eventually South Korea? The answer can be summarized in one sentence. Investors saw the region not as individual countries, but as a single cluster of risk. Fear removes nuance. Once one nation fell, all were assumed to be next. This brings us to a deeper psychological question. Do financial crises begin with numbers or with psychology? Look at history. 1929, 1987, 2000, 2008, 2020. The pattern is clear. Psychology cracks first. Economics collapses second. And 1997 followed that exact script. Before currencies broke, confidence broke. Before companies fell, investors ran. Confidence is the invisible foundation of every financial system. And when confidence collapses, nothing can stop the fall. The cycle was brutal. Currencies fell. Dollar debts exploded. Banks froze lending. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment surged. This was not a collapse caused by a single number or a single mistake. It was created by feedback loops. And the most dangerous loop of all was the reliance on foreign currency debt. Companies across Asia borrowed in US dollars because dollar loans were cheaper. But when local currencies collapsed, those dollar debts doubled or tripled in local terms. A company that looked profitable on Monday could be bankrupt by Friday. This is called the balance sheet effect, and it is one of the most destructive forces in any emerging economy. So could a crisis like 1997 happen again today? To answer that, we must compare yesterday's weaknesses with today's vulnerabilities. In 1997, countries relied heavily on dollar debt. Foreign capital flowed in quickly. Currencies were artificially supported. Financial regulation was weak. Transparency was limited. Today, many emerging economies still carry massive dollar-denominated debt. Capital moves even faster. Currencies remain fragile. And global markets are more interconnected than ever. The same pressure points still exist, Only now, they are bigger. A crisis like 1997 would not remain local. It would not remain regional. And it would not unfold slowly. It would ripple across financial markets instantly. It would strike currencies, banks, supply chains, and corporate balance sheets at the same time. This is why the lessons of 1997 matter so much today. And to understand those lessons, we must look beyond numbers. The crisis showed the world that small economies can trigger massive global consequences. A financial system is only as strong as its most fragile participant. High growth can hide deep structural weaknesses. Rapid growth becomes dangerous when it masks debt, speculation, and fragile financial foundations. Growth built on debt is acceleration toward a cliff. And the cliff always arrives faster than expected. Borrowing in a foreign currency was the silent killer of 1997. When local currencies weakened, dollar debts exploded overnight. Companies that seemed profitable on Monday could be bankrupt by Friday. This risk still exists today in many emerging markets. But the psychological dimension of crisis is just as powerful as the economic dimension. In 1997, confidence broke before the currencies did. When confidence collapses, nothing can stop the fall. Transparency was another weakness. In 1997, data was manipulated, incomplete, or painted in overly optimistic colors. Without accurate data, investors assumed the worst. The same lack of transparency exists in some economies today. Indonesia showed the world how financial collapse can transform into social collapse. A crisis hits people first: families, jobs, savings, stability. But a crisis can also be a catalyst for transformation. South Korea used the crisis as a turning point, not as a tombstone. The modern world must learn that an economy looks strongest right before it breaks. People ignore risks. They trust momentum. They assume optimism is safety. This is exactly what happened in 1997. And this is exactly what can happen again. The lessons are clear. Small economies can create global earthquakes. Debt-driven growth always ends painfully. Foreign currency borrowing is a silent trap. Confidence, not data, keeps financial systems alive. Crises build quietly, then strike all at once. History doesn't repeat exactly, but financial crises always rhyme. And right now, the rhyme is getting louder. Understanding the past won't stop the next crisis, but it prepares you for the warning signs.